So I'm talking with William Green, a veteran financial journalist, about his latest book, Richer, Wiser, Happier. Thanks so much for talking, William.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. So the title of your book, it's kind of interesting. You were including, I guess, a lot of perspective from very wealthy billionaire, multimillionaire investors. But the one thing I wondered, are billionaires ever really happy?
It depends who you ask and which of them you interview. I'm not really claiming that becoming extremely wealthy is a recipe for happiness. As we know, these people tend to be full of angst and stress, and they have lots of lawsuits and broken marriages and the like. So it would be inane to claim that there's a direct link between wealth and happiness. But I think the small subset of great investors that I write about have what John Maynard Keynes called worldly wisdom. And they're extraordinary thinkers. And they're thinking about, as Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's partner, who I interviewed for the book, says, he says, I observe what works and what doesn't work and why. And so I think they become an extraordinarily helpful filter to think about not just what works in markets, but actually about broader questions like, how do you deal with the fact that the future is unknowable, and yet we have to make decisions about the future? Or what sort of habits help us to be productive, to have balanced lives, to be successful? Or how do you deal with pain, failure, setbacks, which is a really integral part of any money manager's life? So I think rather than claiming that they have the key to happiness and embody happiness themselves, I think they give you a lot of clues about what makes for a happy life, including what does the money actually do for you, which is the subject of the epilogue of my book. What actually, if you interview all of these people who've hit the jackpot financially and have yachts and planes and palatial homes, what do you actually discover the money gives them, and what doesn't it give them? And what you discover is that the single most important thing it gives them actually is independence. It's the ability to live in a way that's deeply aligned with who they are. And I don't think you have to be a billionaire to live in a way that's deeply aligned with who you are. But it's pretty helpful if you have a really unpleasant boss, or you have work that you don't like, to be able to say, I'm sorry, I'm gone. I'm going to do something that's deeply aligned with who I am. And I don't care how much you're paying me.
That is an interesting perspective. Another question I kind of wanted to get out of the way. When we talk about the success of these incredibly successful investors, are any of them really self-made, or do they have what sort of, I'm sure that some amount of wealth to start with or other capital resources may be an important factor. Is that something you found, or is anyone?
I think in most cases, the investors I've written about are self-made. There are definitely some who were handed tremendous advantages. They were sent to Harvard Business School or Wharton or the like, but a lot of them came from pretty modest circumstances. And I think probably early on, to some degree, the money was a motivation, that they wanted to become financially independent. If you look at people like Buffett and Munger, they definitely wanted to be financially independent, not to be subject to some annoying boss telling them what to do. But I think ultimately all of these great investors ended up being obsessed with the game. It's fascinating when you see just how many of the great investors actually played things like poker and all of these games, blackjack, whatever it is, any game of probabilities. I remember interviewing Peter Lynch many years ago, who was the famous fund manager from Fidelity, and he said, instead of reading books, you do much better actually just to play poker. And he used to play poker when he was in the army, for example. John Templeton, who was probably the greatest global stock picker of the 20th century, I interviewed in probably about 20 years ago at his home in the Bahamas. And he had actually funded a lot of his college education with his winnings from poker, even though he was a very pious and religious and kind of moralistic guy in some ways, which turned me off at the time. I was kind of fascinated by the fact that he told me while he was at Yale, his father basically wrote to him and said, look, I can't afford to pay even a single dollar for your education anymore. And so Templeton, this is during the Great Depression. So Templeton basically got a bunch of different jobs, made money off his poker winnings and still somehow managed to come first in his class at Yale. So there's a good example of someone who really was in it for the game in some ways. He lived a nice life. I mean, his house in the Bahamas was pretty beautiful, and it was in the same community as people like, the Aga Khan and Sean Connery. But I think that ability to play games is it's pretty consistent. It's not surprising that Buffett and Munger are playing bridge the whole time.
That is interesting. Are there any other aspects of this that readers would come away with and feeling very surprised about?
I think one of the most striking things for me again and again was to see how unemotional the best investors are. So, for example, you look at someone like Howard Marks, who is a multi-billionaire who manages something like $140 billion at Oaktree. And there was a period, for example, during the financial crisis, where there was a 15-week period where I think for every single week, he was investing about $500 to $600 million in busted investments that everybody else was desperate to sell. And I asked him if it was difficult emotionally. And he's like, no, I don't remember it being difficult at all. And he has this kind of slightly flat affect where he's like, no, everything's fine. And I said to him, so you were always just really unemotional? And he said, yeah. And I knew that he'd been married a couple of times. So I said, well, is this a problem in your relationships? And he's like, oh yeah, in my first marriage, it was a real problem. But he said, more recently, it's not been a problem at all. I've got better at it. And I find that kind of consistent with most of the great investors, that they're not caught up in the mood of the market. If you think of most of us, when the market is surging, we tend to get carried away and complacent. And when it's plunging, we tend to sort of bury our head in our hands and panic a bit and curl up in fetal position in the corner of the room crying. And these guys, they're just sort of dispassionately analyzing the odds, and they're saying, oh, this is extremely cheap, let me buy now. And so there's a very interesting Canadian investor, a guy called Francois Rochon, who said to me that most people are tribal. And he said there are certain people in the population who are non-tribal, who don't feel a need to kind of hide in the herd. And he pointed out that actually he's an art collector as well as a money manager. And he pointed out that it's not just the greatest investors who tend to be non-tribal, but also actually writers and artists tend to be non-tribal. And I think that's actually one reason why I'm so drawn to writing about the greatest investors is, as a writer, I think I'm pretty non-tribal. You're always on the outside, kind of looking at what's happening, writing about interesting people, rather than you're both inside and outside the crowd. You're watching the action, you're part of the action, but you're sort of detached from it. And I think when you look at people like Munger or Howard Marks, they're just non-tribal. They've constructed lives that are very, very independent. And I think if there's one thing I'm sort of jealous of when I look at a lot of these people, it's that the fact that they're so wealthy enables them just to kind of disconnect from the things that most people have to do. So someone like Bill Miller, who was the greatest mutual fund manager of his generation, famously beat the market for 15 years in a row. I remember him saying to me, yeah, I haven't flown on a commercial flight in 20 years, and I don't pump gas or anything like that. And there was a certain point where someone asked him to give a keynote speech at some big fancy event. And he just wrote to them and he said, I've thrown away my tuxedo and I'm never buying another one. And so I think in some ways, the greatest investors, like the best writers, have this kind of independent streak, but we can't afford to indulge it in the way that the greatest investors can, where they can just say, no, I'm not flying. I'm not flying on some horrible plane where I have to sit like this and be totally uncomfortable.
Interesting. What has one thing that is interesting that you're discussing here is this independence and this kind of eccentricity, that can be portrayed either positively or negatively, and sometimes it's a matter of degree. Why do you think that these people, the greatest investors that you're talking about, why are they viewed positively, whereas perhaps some others who may have similar qualities are not?
Yeah, it may be that people idolize money in a ridiculous way, that they assume somehow that if someone has become wildly rich, that they have some superior characteristics. And I think that's kind of naive. You want you want to look at these people in the whole and say, well, yeah, but what's happening to their relationships? What's happening to their kids? Are they decent people to spend your time with? And I've tended in a very idiosyncratic way to write about investors that I actually admire and like personally. And there were a few occasions when I started to write about some multi-billionaire I had interviewed, and I just sort of thought, I can't face it. I just don't like this person. And I think just the ability to make vast quantities of money, it's a good game. I mean, if you have an ability to decode the market and crack that code, great. But that only takes you so far. And so I'm fascinated. For example, I read at great length about these two guys in London, Nick Sleep and Keith Sakaria, who'd never really given interviews before, who had astonishing performance. They set up a hedge fund that beat the market by something like 800 percentage points over 13 years. And they racked up about $3.5 billion in assets. And then at the ripe old age of 45, retired, returned billions of dollars to the investors in their funds, and decided, well, we're going to spend the second half of our lives giving away the money in a way that creates the maximum good for society. And so in the same way that they'd used their brilliant minds to crack the code of how to make money, they're now using their brilliant minds to crack the code of how to give it away in order to have a huge social impact. And so I'm fascinated by people like that who, yeah, they're great game players, but they're also giving you an indication of how to live your life, what makes for an abundant life, what actually constitutes a successful life. And I think it would be naive just to assume that because they won this particular game of picking mispriced stocks, that they were somehow morally superior. I think what makes them really admirable are things like the way they treated each other, the way they treated their shareholders, which was incredibly honorable. I mean, they kept doing things like changing their fee structure to make it less attractive for themselves and more attractive for their shareholders. And so that's really interesting to me, because it becomes this kind of exploration of what actually constitutes an honorable, well-lived life, which I think is what they were interested in. And so instead of just saying, yeah, we want to end our lives with the most number of yachts and houses, they were thinking, well, no, we want to spend time with our families. We want to travel. We want to give back to society. And I'm really curious about those sort of people who've not just won the game of investing, but who in some sense give you an indication of what it takes to win the game of life, because that's a game as well.
Right, absolutely. Are there any lessons that readers can take from your book that they can apply, to their own financial lives? It's certainly quite a big difference between running gigantic mutual funds or whatever and, the average person.
No, there are tons of lessons. One of the most valuable to me was from studying someone like Joel Greenblatt, who has this extraordinary record. He set up a hedge fund when he was about 27, that over the next 20 years averaged 40% a year, which means you turn $1 million into $836 million. And so I spent a lot of time with Joel, and I was interviewing him at his house in the Hamptons, and I'm like, okay, so what's the secret? How did you decode the market and win this game? And he said, well, it's incredibly simple. He said, all you're doing, it all comes down to this. He said, you figure out what a business is worth, and then you buy it for much less, and that's it. And so you think about that, and there's a really beautiful simplicity to it, that the whole game, as played by people like Buffett, Munger, Joel Greenblatt, Howard Marks, is to value assets and then buy them at a discount. But then you think about what actually it takes to execute that. The concept, the principle itself is absolute simplicity. But then you start to think about it and you think, well, can I actually value a business? Do I know how to value businesses? Am I interested in valuing businesses? And for someone like me, I start thinking, well, no, I'm a writer. I'm not that. I don't have any accounting knowledge. I'm not interested in spending my time looking through the account statements of a company and figuring out whether they're lying, whether they're hyping stuff, or whether it's truthful. And so for me, one of the great lessons is to look at the greatest investors and say, well, they're different than I am. They have knowledge and an expertise that I don't have. They're less emotional than I am. I'm much more fearful. I'm much more anxious than they are. So then I say, well, one of the reasons the greatest investors succeed is that they say you should only play games you can win. So I start to think, well, picking individual stocks is not really a game I'm equipped to win, either temperamentally or intellectually. So I shouldn't play it. And so there's a really important practical takeaway for our viewers here, which is you have to have the self-knowledge to say, well, do I have these analytical skills? Do I have the ability to analyze and value a stock? Do I have the temperament to buy it for less, which usually means that it looks awful in the near term and everyone else hates it? And I don't really. So I try very rarely to buy an individual stock. And so the default position for most people, according to Howard Marks or Joel Greenblatt, is that most people, as Howard Marks says, should index most of their money. And so for me, counterintuitively, spending all of this time with the greatest investors has led me to do less myself and to say, all right, well, I should hedge against my own incompetence and fallibility and stupidity and haplessness by owning a couple of index funds, which will get most of the, well, they'll be probably 70-80% of all investors anyway. So that's a good start. And then let me invest with a couple of money managers, active money managers, who I believe have a temperament that gives them an advantage and an analytical ability that gives them an advantage. So that self-awareness, I think, is actually critical. Just as I wouldn't compete in the Olympics high bar or high beam or whatever it is, because, you know, I'm 20 pounds overweight and I can, you know, barely touch my toes. Actually, I can't even touch my toes. So why would I do gymnastics? It's not a game I can win. So why would I do that any more than I would do sort of eye surgery on myself? So why should I assume that I should pick individual stocks? So I think that's a really valuable takeaway. I outsource the job to someone who's better suited to win the game. And yet this sounds so obvious, but then you look at all of these people who've just set up their accounts with Robinhood and they're like, yeah, I can decide whether Robinhood is actually going up, or, you know, they're just momentum players. They're just buying whatever is hot. There's no knowledge there. They're not reading through the IPO statements and saying, yeah, this looks really scummy. This looks really immoral or low grade, or no, there really is something that they've tapped into that is going to work out. They're just kind of speculating blindly. And so that, for me, just knowing my own limitations is a really important starting point, because it tells me what not to do.
Right. I was going to ask you about that, but you touched on it briefly. What do you think these investors would think of the meme stock generation and the Reddit people and the crypto people?
Yeah, I was just thinking about this because I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal about Cathie Wood and ARK and how, you know, she is doubling down on Bitcoin and Tesla. And I keep thinking of something Howard Marks said to me, where he said, look, on the whole, when things or people are very successful, it brings in hubris, and we tend to overestimate ourselves and overestimate companies. And I remember him talking about this with the FANG stocks and saying to me, you know, will these trees grow to the sky? I don't know. Usually things stop growing at a certain point. They stop growing to the sky. And maybe I'm wrong, and these are the first perpetual motion machines, but I'm not prepared to bet on it. And Buffett often says there are certain things where he just puts them in what he calls his too hard pile. And when I look at things like Bitcoin, Tesla, stuff like that, yeah, maybe they keep flying. I don't know. But I know that, to use a phrase from Charlie Munger, that it's a standard stupidity to bet on things that are really hot and that you don't necessarily understand. So I'm personally not going to do it, because I know from Charlie Munger that my life and my portfolio are going to be more successful if I reduce what he calls standard stupidities. And so betting on things just because they're flying is a pretty predictably standard stupid thing to do. Then again, I interviewed Bill Miller recently, and he's just made an enormous amount of money on Bitcoin, and he's one of the most brilliant guys I've ever interviewed. And I remember him saying to me back in, I think, 2001, he had bought 15% of Amazon, and almost everybody thought Amazon was going bankrupt, and all of his peers thought he was a moron. And he's like, yeah, if they're right, I'll lose 100% of my money. And if I'm wrong, I'll make 50 times my money. And here we are all these years later. He told me that he's personally the single largest individual shareholder in Amazon, whose name is not Bezos, other than Bezos' ex-wife now. And so his ability to go against the crowd with Amazon made him spectacularly rich. And here again with Bitcoin, all of his peers like Buffett and Munger, who he admires tremendously, say Bitcoin is rat poison. And here's Bill Miller, who I think he told me his average purchase price was something like $200 to $300 per Bitcoin. And here we are, it's what, 40,000 now. So this is part of what makes investing so fascinating is you look at Bill Miller's bet on Bitcoin, or you look at Cathie Wood and Tesla, and you're like, I don't know. This is complicated, and really smart people disagree. But I think on the whole, you're better off focusing on things that are undervalued. I think that's for me, temperamentally, that's a smart strategy. And it means you miss out on certain high-flying things, but that suits my temperament. I'd rather not be rolling the dice on Tesla when it's soaring. And that means you miss out on some really glorious things, but then I think Tesla down, what, a third, or maybe not, but Bitcoin is down a third in the last few months, right? And so you never know. It's really complicated.
Right. Investing in what you know seems like the good basic lesson.
Yeah, and Jeffrey Gundlach, one of these billionaires that I interviewed, who's often called the king of bonds, said to me, look, I'm wrong a third of the time. And if there's one thing Gundlach isn't, it's humble, right? I mean, Gundlach has enormous confidence and enormous conviction, very highly intelligent guy, very successful. And he's like, yeah, I'm wrong a third of the time. And so I have to constantly be saying, what's the consequence if I'm wrong? And so if you want to take a flutter and, invest a little bit in Bitcoin or Tesla or GameStop or whatever it is that's zooming at that point, fine, enjoy yourself, but always be saying, what's the consequence if I'm wrong? And one of the things that Howard Marks said to me is, really the question is, are you overreaching? Are you living within your means? Are you indebted? Are you overexposed? And so you always have to be saying, if the next period turns out to be different from the current period, let's say we've been going through a great period and suddenly that changes, how exposed am I? If suddenly I lost my job, how exposed would I be? Do I have too much debt? Am I living beyond my means? I found myself, I lost a job at exactly the same time that the stock market halved. And, thankfully, because I was such a pessimist as a journalist who'd been through many rounds of layoffs and survived them, I always thought eventually I'd get laid off. So I had no debt. And so one of the things that made me resilient during the financial crisis was the fact that that I had no debt. And so when I got laid off, I found a new job. I didn't have to sell any of my stock. And so I think constantly that attitude of mind where you're saying, how can I remove fragility from my life and my portfolio, assuming that I'm going to be wrong a third of the time, assuming that the future is uncertain, that none of us can actually predict the future. How do I construct a life that's relatively unfragile and a portfolio that's relatively unfragile? And as Howard Marks would say, one way you do it is by admitting the fact you can't predict the future. So be humble, because as he said to me with COVID, he said, look, we saw with COVID, it's not just that you can't predict the future, you have no idea what even could happen, let alone what will happen.
Right.
And so you have to go into things with a sense of humility, of saying, as Howard says, he belongs to the I don't know school of thought. So start with the assumption that the world is a very uncertain place, that things can change, that things happen that we would never imagine, and position yourself to survive an uncertain future, which doesn't mean being super pessimistic, but it means just being rational to make sure that you're not overreaching. And so for me, I've become increasingly obsessed with the idea of being a resilient investor. And there's a chapter of my book called The Resilient Investor, where I'm talking about not focusing so much on trying to beat the market, but actually, am I going to survive? And there was one point where I interviewed a guy called Irving Kahn, who lived to the age of 109. And so here's a guy who's lived through absolutely everything. He started as a professional stock picker in 1928, a year before the crash. And he spent something like 80 years as an investor in the markets, a professional investor. So you think of all of the things that he went through, you know, World War II, the Great Depression, Vietnam, multiple crashes and meltdowns. And he survived everything. And one of the reasons he was a very close student and friend and teaching assistant of Ben Graham, who was Buffett's teacher. And so when I asked him what the secret of investment success was, he said it comes down to one word. He said it's just safety. So he said, before you start thinking of getting great returns, think about your downside. Think about how to protect yourself against loss. And so in a sense, I think as journalists, we tend to write so much about the game, the kind of horse race of beating the market. And I think that's a kind of disservice to readers, because they should really be thinking about, no, how do I survive? How do I reach the finish line? And it doesn't really matter to me whether I beat the market or not. I kind of need to know, will I be financially secure? Will I be financially independent? Can I pay for my kids' colleges? Can I retire? Can I do the kind of work that I like and be able to fund my own life? Do I care if I beat the market by 1 percentage point, 2 percentage points, or I underperform by 1%? Not really. And so I need to focus much more on setting myself up to be resilient, which I think means avoiding a lot of stupid speculation on things you don't understand, keeping your costs down. I mean, I remember Jack Bogle, the founder of Vanguard, which now manages, $7 trillion, telling me once about the impact just of fees on eroding your return. I think his example, right. I remember him going through the numbers where the difference in, if you spent 1.5% a year in expenses over 30 years, if your $1 million went up by 10% a year, it was something like a $6 or $7 million difference over 30 years. I mean, those expenses just erode your return massively. Mm-hmm. So you want to control those things, like not trading in and out of the market, making sure you keep your expenses low, making sure you stay in the market through thick and thin, and in the times when the market's getting killed, at the very least you don't sell, but hopefully you actually have the strength to buy more, and then you just kind of ride the upward trajectory of the market over many years. And so this isn't rocket science. And if you avoid the standard stupidities and you benefit from long-term compounding, as Bogle said to me, you don't actually need to be great. You kind of just need to stay in the game.